Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Conversation of Our Generation. And today I have a great conversation for you with Alan Cornett. And we talk a lot about really the culture, where it is right now, what's going on, and some ways that we can address it. And looking at it really from a conservative angle. Alan is a very, I shouldn't say very, comes from the traditional conservative background and really brings an interesting point of view, I think, and one that he and I were able to really build on and have sort of a yes and conversation where we're building on each other's ideas and going back and forth. And I think it was a lot of fun doing it like that. It's always nice when you can find places where you disagree and can hash out why that is. But I also think it's fun where you can have a conversation with someone you do have a lot of common ground with and are not coming at it from a combative, but sort of a let's build together sort of mentality. And I think that that's what we have here in this conversation. So definitely tune in to the rest of this episode and listen, because I think it's just a lot of great knowledge in there. And so before I dive too much into that, I want to let you know that Alan is the creator of the Cultural Debris podcast, which is his new podcast, but also you might know him from his Eat Kentucky podcast as well. And those will be linked up in the show notes for you to check out. But he is a former assistant to Russel Kirk. So we talk a lot about Russel Kirk. We talked a lot about the kind of conservatism that Russel Kirk ushered in and what he was sort of a thought leader for. And I think that that is really cool to have someone who knew him personally, who was able to speak on his ideas and his legacy from that personal perspective. And so that was really, really interesting. I think that anyone who's interested in Russel Kirk, interested in kind of this modern, newer look at a conservative movement, you're going to enjoy this. And so I definitely recommend you check out the rest of this episode. And before I dive too much into anything else, I want to remind you that you can find more about what I'm doing at conversationfourgeneration.com. Go there, go to the Amazon affiliates. I know you might be doing some Christmas shopping soon. If you click the Amazon affiliate link there, go to Amazon through that link, buy whatever you're going to buy. It helps support me. There's also any book reviews. You're like, hey, I want to get some reading done over the holidays, right? And I say holidays as in Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. There's a lot of different holidays in there that you might have time off for. And if you have some reading time, definitely check out some of the book reviews that I have going on and grab those through my links as well. That helps out the conversation of our generation. And subscribe to the podcast, wherever you're listening to that right now. That is one of the biggest things you can do. Subscribe, leaving a good rating, and sharing this with other people. Following on Twitter at ConOfOurGen, Facebook.com/ConversationOfOurGeneration, all that stuff. Anywhere where you are and consuming content, I'm sure that the Conversation of Our Generation is there. So definitely check it out, all those places. YouTube as well. Just search Conversation of Our Generation, and you'll find me there as well. And so with that, let's hop on over to the interview with Alan. All right. Hi, Alan. Thank you for joining me today for the Conversation of Our Generation.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
For sure, for sure. I'm really excited to have this conversation, talking about lots of cool stuff, but I'm curious to get, or I guess my audience would be curious to know a little bit more about you and what you're doing, and and the Cultural Debris podcast as well.
Yeah, so the Cultural Debris podcast is a new project of mine. At the time of this recording, 2 episodes out. Hopefully, by the time people hear this, 3 episodes out. I'm finishing editing on my next one, and I've got a couple of interviews already done. So it's just a matter of kind of processing those and getting them out. So I'm not necessarily on a strict schedule with it. It's sort of an occasional podcast, but I'd like to get ideally a couple of episodes a month out. It's once a week is more than I can manage generally. Sometimes if things are going well, I might do back-to-back weeks or something. I also have another podcast that I've had going for a little over a year that is a food podcast called Eat Kentucky. So, there may not be a lot of overlap with your audience on that, but it's people are welcome to search it and a couple dozen episodes out of it.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I'll have to tell, one of the guys I work with is a big food kind of guy. Like, he just, when you eat a meal with him, you're like, it feels like you're eating it with a sommelier. He's just like, oh, and then there's this and this, and they're probably, and I'm just like, food just kind of tastes good or it
That's
doesn't.
right. Is he taking pictures for Instagram?
I don't know if he does that, but he's a great cook, and he told like you'll come into work and he'll be like, oh yeah, over the weekend I did this, I smoked this, and you're like, oh, why didn't you tell me what?
That's right. Where was my invitation?
Yeah, so I'll
So
have to let him know.
the Cultural Debris podcast, which is probably what most of your listeners will be interested in, is it's kind of a catch-all. It's deliberately broad and vague because I don't want it to be too specific. The idea of cultural debris comes from an essay that Russel Kirk wrote back in the 50s when he was still young and tooling around Scotland. He was did his graduate work at St. Andrews University, did his PhD there, or actually his Doctor of Literature. And in the essay, which is also included in the Portable Conservative Reader that came out years ago, there's a series of portable whatevers, and he edited the Portable Conservative Reader.
Okay.
He includes it in that, so he obviously thought highly of it. But people can go read it on the Kirk Center website. It's available just for free reading if somebody wants to zip over to Kirk Center and read it there. But in it, he talks about going around to the back country of Scotland with this sort of wealthy friend of his who happened to collect Latin texts. That was his hobby. And they would go to these little random small secondhand bookshops in Scotland, and they would buy these old leather bound volumes of Latin texts for, not much money. And when I was an assistant for Dr. Kirk, he had a lot of books that he had purchased at estate sales and so forth when he was in Scotland, old leather bound volumes. But his friend talks about how we're like people on a raft or on a small boat who are on the water after a great ship has sunk, and all of this flotsam has come up to the surface of this great ship, and we are sort of going around picking up almost like a salvage crew, if you will, just picking up bits and pieces that have come up, and with the idea that you're sort of at the end of a great civilization, and you're trying to preserve what you can is kind of the idea of it. So that idea, that essay, has always appealed to me, and so this is a project that I've honestly thought about for a long time, and it was just a matter of kind of putting it together to launch it. But I sort of wanted to talk about things I want to talk about, which the question is whether anybody else wants to listen to them or not. But it's approaching sort of broad cultural topics, but from a broadly conservative, traditionalist standpoint, with the idea that we may be talking about things that are sort of, from a larger society standpoint, sort of on their last legs or very obscure, but there are people who are still interested in those things, and some of those things may be worth reviving and saving and rejuvenating. And that's really one of the things that Dr. Kirk would write about as the role of the conservative, is that you're not simply trying to hold on to or defend sort of stale old ideas, but that you are finding the best of the past or the present, and you are seeking to kind of keep the flame alive and breathe new life into it. So conservatism is not meant to be something that's stagnant, but the role of the conservative, and I mean this not in a political way at all, but is to identify that which is good, which may have been forgotten, and try to revive that, because it is recognized to be something valuable and that is beneficial to people or to society at large, but that they may just not know about it and they may need to have their eyes open to it. So it's a way for me to kind of touch on topics that fall under that intentionally broad umbrella, which also kind of corresponds with things I want to talk about and people I want to talk to. So it basically, I don't have an agenda. I don't have the next 10, 15 episodes lined up on a sheet of paper. I have some mental idea of some people I wouldn't mind talking to, but I have a couple of interviews in the can, and so those are going to be the next episode. So it's intentionally broad.
Mm-hmm. I like that. I find at the Conversation for Our Generation, it's very similar. I kind of touch on a lot of topics, and I really liked your kind of idea behind this, because for me, what I talk about is solving the problems of today with the wisdom of the past, and finding
Sure.
those ideas and those solutions and the situations that we can look at in history that kind of mirror what we're seeing today. And how do we pull from this vast history, wealth of knowledge that's out there, and apply that to our current situation? And I think that for me, one person who was very influential in my thinking was Roger Scruton, and was, for me, as someone who was very libertarian, was the only person or the first person rather, to make a good conservative argument and push me towards that more traditional way of thinking, I
Yeah,
think.
Scruton is great, and I think that there's a lot of overlap between Kirk and Scruton. Scruton's kind of a British Kirk in a way. They had different emphases. Of course, they were kind of a generation apart from each other. Dr. Kirk passed away in the mid 90s. But there's actually a conference that I got to go to in, I guess it would have been the fall of 1993, and it was commemorating the ISI did it, and it was commemorating, or maybe it's the Philadelphia Society. I guess it's the Philadelphia Society. It was commemorating the anniversary of the Conservative Mind, which of course is Dr. Kirk's major book, his biggest, I guess, most influential book. And Roger Scruton delivered the address for it. And so I got to hear Roger Scruton. That's the only time I ever saw him. I sadly didn't get to meet him. I would have liked to have actually talked to him, but he spoke, and that that address, the video for that is on YouTube, with Roger Scruton speaking at the Kirk anniversary. So there's a Conservative Mind anniversary. So there's a kind of a confluence there that's preserved, and I would encourage people to go listen to that. But Scruton is absolutely one of the great champions of conservative and traditional thought, and from a very British standpoint. They did a TV show with Scruton a few years ago. I think it was done by some Dutch station. There was this Dutch reporter who went and interviewed him, and she apparently had interviewed him before, but she visited him on his farm, which he called Scrutopia. And it was on YouTube for a long time, and the last time I tried to find it, I couldn't. So I don't know if it got somebody issued a copyright violation and they yanked it or what. But if you can find that, it is an absolutely beautiful picture of what conservatism is. And I mean, you want to go be Roger Scruton and live on Scrutopia and kind of have this life. He's got this sort of this idyllic life that he had built for himself, and thankfully he was able to enjoy that for at least a few years before his untimely passing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, for me, I know I'm still trying to talk my wife. We're young, and so being kind of amid the breweries and everything, and I'm in Indianapolis, so
Hmm.
some of that, it's actually becoming a more lively city than it was growing up for me. But I'm still like, maybe we could move out into the country a little bit and get away and have
Sure. Yeah,
I
absolutely.
smoke a pipe and read. And she's
Uh,
like,
that
well,
she's not going for that yet.
not yet. I think, so far we haven't had the riots or anything here in Indianapolis. So you kind of have those sorts of unrest. And I think that changes people's minds about the city a little bit. But
Yeah, that's true. Things have been pretty calm here in Lexington. Louisville's been a little bit rowdier, but there were some kind of what seemed like kind of obligatory protests for a while, but they're, to my knowledge, they've not had anything in a while, and those didn't seem to be particularly destructive.
no, we had a little bit of stuff when it first broke out, and then they kind of like squashed it and they marched up to the mayor's house or mayor's office and did that. And then he said, hey, I see what you guys are saying. I hear you. And then they marched back. And that was kind of it for protest. It was
Yeah.
very calm, not too crazy. But I've talked to a couple people, the Vital Masculinity podcast guys, for my listeners, and they're in, upstate New York and North Carolina, and they had seen a lot of stuff around them.
Yeah.
That's gone a little crazy. But yeah, I just think that simple, slower way of life, I know recently for me, has just become much more appealing, especially working.
Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of people. I grew up in a rural area in Eastern Kentucky, and very very much sort of a slow paced kind of existence. My parents still live there, in a farm where not a lot of farming went on. My parents were teachers, and but still, it was this was way back when, before there were crazy things like the internet or cell phones or anything like that. So there's a lot to be said for that. As I look back, I'm very glad that I grew up before there were cell phones or the internet, because I know I would have loved them, but I think that I definitely had a more fulfilling, healthy childhood not having those things.
For sure. I know that my childhood is kind of like on the cusp of where that became very prolific. So there were kids when I was in middle school who had cell phones, and then there was a big group, which included me for the most part, that did not. And I think that my brothers growing up 5 years, 7 years after me, it's just very, very different. And I know that there's just this plugged inness that we have. And I think that I was like the last to get the new game console because my parents were kind of holding off, and they're like, just go play outside. Like they tried to
Mm-hmm.
get me to do that. And so
I was very excited when I got my Atari for Christmas, and pop in Ms. Pac-Man and play.
yeah, exactly. And so I kind of my parents urged that a lot more. Like I had to read as a kid to earn the video game time and all of that stuff. And I think that I still have a detachment, but I do find like Twitter and some things and wanting to know the news and be just constantly consuming information, really for me, like podcasts are the place where I find myself potentially overly indulging, kind of like in the Twilight Zone. There was that kind of the guy who the apocalypse happens and he's stuck in the bank vault with his book, and he's like, finally, I can read all the books. No one can distract me. There's no one around me my wife can't say, hey, we got to go do this thing. I find myself erring towards that a little bit. And
yeah, it's a lot better place to be. I mean, I can definitely tell a difference, and it frustrates me that I spend too much time on Twitter and so forth, and that it's harder for me to concentrate for long periods of time on a book. And I've read my entire life, and it's I feel like at this point in my life I ought to be more content with reading than I was when I was younger, and in a lot of ways it's the opposite. Excuse me. But I think a lot of that's just simply the constant bombardment that we have with, especially with social media. I avoid the constant barrage of cable news, we don't, I'll talk to my mom, who is sort of a stereotypical Fox News watcher. I say that with great love, but she'll ask me about something she's seen, and I'll say, well, I don't have Fox, and she always seems surprised, but the only thing we do have CNN, but I never watch it because it's CNN. So I get, I just, it's definitely been a positive to break myself away from cable news, which I did several years ago. And I'm sure it would be better to break myself away from Twitter. But one of the things that I'm sure you found on Twitter is there really is an opportunity for building a community of like-minded people on social media. And really, I think Twitter, at least for people my age, more works better than anywhere else. Facebook, not so much. But I can find people that I can interact with on a daily basis who have a similar worldview to me. And that's honestly not something that I can find easily locally, and direct human contact, especially as we've learned over the past few months, is better than not having direct human contact. But at the same time, it is also refreshing to be able to talk to people, and I mean virtually talk, but communicate with people who know the ideas, know the authors, and have kind of a similar approach to those things. And so there is a way in which social media is very helpful in building community. And so there's that yin and yang of it, I guess, of on the one hand, it can become consuming. It can cause us to be overly distractible. And I'm definitely guilty of both of those things. But at the same time, there are people like yourself who I never would have had probably come into contact with if it were not for Twitter, and all sorts of people like that, and people that I have gotten to know virtually, and a few people that I've actually met in person too, that I would be sorry not to be able to have contact with them, and know what they're doing and know what they're thinking, and joke around and that sort of thing. And so that's a refreshing thing, because Russel Kirk talks about this idea all through his writings. Modern society, sort of mass society, is a very atomized society. The old little platoons have broken down that Burke talked about, that are so vital to conservatism. Through social media, maybe through things like podcasts, they are ways that we can find some modern points of contact where we can center around certain ideas and ways of looking at things. I mean, your podcast, my podcast are probably, we're probably never going to get a $1 billion deal from Spotify. That's unlikely. But I've been pleased with the response that I've gotten from the first couple of episodes of Cultural Debris. And, and I sometimes think, well, is somebody else doing this already? Is somebody else doing this better? And probably yes, on both accounts. But I can at least do something that I find satisfying, because one of the things that I like to do is just be able to sit down and talk to people. I mean, one of the good reasons to have a podcast is that you can get people to sit down and talk to you who otherwise wouldn't do it, right? Say, hey, you could be on my podcast, we'll talk. It's like, okay, sure. And and you can sit and talk to them about a particular topic, and that's good. And then maybe there might be a few people out there who are interested enough to sit down and listen to it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I think that there is something to just I don't necessarily need this to be, like you said, $1 billion deal. What I would like more than anything is that this is something that I can do, enjoy, and, you know, you have like a community of 1,000 people who are engaged really in the dialogue, and have a community where people can share things. And like, I think one of the podcasts I listen to is the Survival Podcast, and he has this really active community where people will send him articles, and he talks about gardening and permaculture and all of this stuff. And people will be like, hey, did you see this technique? Did you see this thing? And he can bring that to a huge audience of people because there's kind of this feedback loop between the audience. And I think that's something that is really cool about today, that, and very, I think, could be incredibly productive too in creating new ideas and establishing ideas and testing ideas that, the founding fathers writing pamphlets didn't necessarily have. That, when you put out the written word with the, once the printing press was out there, that revolutionized things, but you still didn't have that instant feedback, that sort of where you could fill up a Slack community and start talking about ideas right after a podcast goes out and get immediate feedback and see where you're going wrong and start to correct your ideas on the fly. I think that that's something that is a huge potential now, and using this kind of immediate means of communication for good things instead of just passing on doom and gloom constantly, or
Right.
the talking points at each other that you've already heard from the last, person, the last Republican or Democrat you talked to, you said the exact same talking points because they
Yeah,
heard them on
amazingly. Yeah, I
just
mean, you'll see on Twitter where people will use literally the exact same words in their tweets because obviously things went out. But talking about that, the Kirk Center, this of the time of this recording, they're doing like a virtual book club, and so people who have ties to the Kirk Center, of course, it's free. You can just hop on, and they have some scholars lined up who are going to talk about this. But in fact, the book they're talking about is about Samuel Johnson and this sort of club that he had that was meant to spread and talk about these ideas. And so that's going back, to the time of Johnson and Burke. That, and again, it's these little platoons, it's these mediating institutions, and they don't have to be formal. And in fact, in many ways, it's better if they're not, or at least some of them aren't. I mean, you're going to have some things like your church and so forth that will be more formal. But it's something that I think that we have missed. And of course, the past 8 months have been really destructive to it because it's isolated people. And regardless of what people's thoughts about the necessity of lockdowns and so forth, the result has been very devastating. And I think that there's really no debate about that. And I think that we don't even appreciate the degree to which it has been. And I am afraid that it's something that's going to have a lot of long-term consequences because it's kind of taught people to be further isolated. Mm-hmm. And that's not really something that we need. I mean, yeah, it's nice to, I guess, lounge around your house in your pajamas and not have to worry about that kind of, getting ready and whatever, seeing people. But at the same time, there are benefits to that because we are social creatures, and we need that. And it, is very, very damaging to people spiritually because people couldn't gather for worship and so forth. And some places still really can't. And everywhere, I think there are restrictions on, how many can be there and wearing masks and so forth. And even mask wearing, again, this isn't a debate about whether masks are useful or necessary at all. But with a mask, you don't even know who people are a lot of times. I mean, I've seen people run into people at a store or something, and is that, the guy I think it is, is that Bob? Is that Tom? Is that, and you don't know. And you're not really supposed to get close enough to find out, right? So, it's just, if you start thinking about it from that perspective, this, all of this has been very bad from that kind of point of view.
I agree. I think that the masks were, I mean, first of all, we've known since the 40s, we've done study after study about keeping viral spread low, and masks work for bacterial spread because bacteria is bigger than viruses. But it really, the reason why a surgeon wears a mask is not because he doesn't want to spread a virus, it's because he doesn't want to spread bacteria and infect the wound. And because, I mean, that's really why. And so for the people out there who use that objection, that's why, just throwing that out there. But I think that it really dehumanizes people. Like you said, I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
people are like, I ran into my brother-in-law or sister-in-law and did not recognize them in the grocery store. And I think we're to a point where I said this Saturday because I was at one of these places where you kind of have the new speakeasy almost, where you go places and you're like, oh, I don't have to wear a mask here. Like golf courses in the Indiana area are kind of a place where you walk in and the guy behind the thing may have it like kind of on his chin,
Yeah.
but half the time they're not wearing them. They just like keep the door open because it's nice enough to be golfing. So it's nice enough to have the door open, and they're like, you walk in, pay for your golf, walk out. And I was at a bar Saturday night with my wife. She had just passed her nursing board, so we decided to go out and have a drink. And the bar we were at, they had music playing. No one really, I mean, there's people wearing masks, but 80% of people were not. And I don't know, I'm not going to say where this bar was, or
probably wise.
I don't know what the city regulations are, but I don't know if they were violating them or not. But it was.
Well, by the way, congratulations to your wife. My wife is a nurse. She's actually a nurse practitioner now. So I know that getting through boards is not an easy hurdle to get through.
No, she was very happy Sunday when we could just like sit outside, enjoy the day, and she's not, studying on her day off to figure out to get ready for that. Yeah, so that was definitely great. But I think that there's this new kind of like under prohibition. I feel like that's what it's almost like, where you have to find those pockets.
I think that's exactly right. You're going to see more and more kind of underground ways of getting together, because people want to. I mean, for example, I know in California, there very strict guidelines are issued for holiday, Thanksgiving, Christmas gatherings, which were completely completely ridiculous, that no one's really going to follow that. And the idea that people even might be expected to, and we all understand that there are people who are vulnerable and don't need to be exposed. But that said, there is a social need that man has, and there is only so long that we can go without meeting that in some way, and it's not good for society. I mean, I think that you're seeing a lot of the vitriol that we're seeing. Yes, it's driven by partisan politics, but I think it's amplified by a lot of anxiety and depression that people aren't necessarily aware of. There's just a feeling of unease because we don't have those social interactions. We don't feel like we can be at ease around anyone because, I don't know, that guy may have something he's going to give me, and so I have to be careful. And so rather than having a gratitude of seeing somebody, a lot of times there's a hesitancy and a wariness that is just damaging to the social fabric.
Mm-hmm.
And it's whatever is bad, this is making it worse, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I think we're really the only animal that can reject nature in a real way. And I think that we've had throughout human history, we've had real serious problems with natural disasters, with famines, with plagues that have happened, but with war even. But this is something where I feel like our problems and the anxiety and everything that comes from it is because our reaction to this virus has been very unnatural, and it just kind of is almost spitting in the face of our understanding of human nature. And I think that that's something that when you look at the conservative, one of the things that drew me into conservatism more as someone who kind of grew up in a Republican family, but it was kind of always small L libertarian side of things, big like Tea Party thing, kind of wing of the party. Um, I think what drew me in is listening to quotes from Chesterton, listening to people like C.S. Lewis, listening to people like Roger Scruton explain the human person, explain the human experience. And you're like, that just makes sense. That's so intuitive and so real. And I think our society at large has been rejecting that for, I would say, 100 years, more and more so.
Or two.
Yeah, really, I would say, yeah, true. Really, since Darwin, we've had this sort of backlash against human nature, oddly enough, when as soon as we find the origin of humanity, we immediately reject all the basic things we knew about it. It seems like.
And that's really at the core of what Kirk and Scruton understand about conservatism, and that is that conservatism at root accepts human nature for what it is, that it is not seeking, as all ideologies ultimately do. And Dr. Kirk defined conservatism as sort of the negation of ideology. Conservatism is not an ideology, but it's rather a cast of mind. It's a way of looking at the world. And so there's no set program. People can people can embrace certain principles and ideals, but there are prudential decisions that we make. And so you and I may come to a different conclusion about who we want to vote for example, based on our weighing and understanding of different issues. But fundamental to all of that is an understanding and an appreciation for human nature itself. And going back to Rousseau, there has been on the left this desire to perfect man, that we can perfect man, that we can perfect society. And of course, what that led to in the short term was the French Revolution, where there's wheel out the guillotine. And what it led to in the long term were the 20th century communist and fascist ideologies that killed tens of millions of people. Mm-hmm. And in all of that, it was an idea of the perfecting of society, the perfecting of man, and that we have to get rid of dissidents and undesirables because they're in the way of us getting to this perfection. Anytime you get on a mode of thought that leads you to that place, you've embraced an ideology you need to run away from. And that you accept that man and society are fallen, and that there are limitations, and that we do better if we guard ourselves from our limitations than if we try to imagine that we can just cast them aside, And that about Lewis, that's really what his space trilogy is about. And everybody reads Narnia, and I'm all for reading Narnia, but the space trilogy is really addressed in a very stark way. And if I would encourage anybody to read his space trilogy, because it's very, very good in looking at kind of what modernity tries to do and where it ends up, and it's not a pretty place.
Yeah, I like that. I haven't actually read his space trilogy, so I'll have to check that out. I read the
Yeah,
Crown of Narnia books when I was a
really
kid.
good. Yeah, the space trilogy is really good and often overlooked, and they're science fiction, but very much from a C.S. Lewis point of view. You know, it's not normal science fiction, I guess.
Exactly. That I believe that. I think one of the things that you mentioned that it kind of reminds me of that as well. I think it's the opening to The Great Divorce. I could be wrong about this, but I think it's in one of C.S. Lewis's works where it's a quote that's like, uh, it's basically some will say, "Thy will be done," or the difference between basically how you should approach things is instead of talking to God, you shouldn't say, "My will be done." It's "Thy will be done."
Right.
And I think that when you look at interacting with then his creation, you have to say, kind of humbly look at the world around you and accept the circumstances that you're given and act with the given circumstances instead of, and this is what even Aristotle, not, it doesn't have to be a Christian perspective, but even I think there's very good philosophical underpinnings that just work this way. But you take nature as it is and interact with it as it is. And the ideology, I think that comes in when you are trying to impose your ideas on nature instead of allowing nature to inform your ideas.
Right. Right. And that's I mean, there's nobody better who expresses all of that than Wendell Berry, the Kentucky writer and farmer. And he talks about, you know, taking the time to learn literally the lay of the land, the way this particular field in this place even differs from a field not far from there. And that's one of the things about conservatism and traditionalism. And Barry is somebody who has never been interested in partisan politics from a Republican standpoint, but he's very much a traditionalist. But Kirk, Scruton, Barry, any of those writers and thinkers, that they're always looking at the particular, never the abstract. And and when we're talking about making things conform to our vision of what they should be, is always an abstraction, and it's never it's not appreciating the individual for what it is or who it is. And it may be that this field simply won't accept this crop that I want to grow on it, and that what I have to accept is that I need to grow that somewhere else, and I need to find out what will work here. I can work on making this field better. I can help it to to have better soil quality, and I can help to avoid erosion, and I can rotate my crop so that it has better fertility and so forth. But what we see with modern industrial farming is this imposition, heavy equipment and so forth, and it's the complete opposite. And that's why, again, something like industrialization is inherently unconservative, because it's too big not to be. And so anything that gets too big is going to inherently be unconservative, because it can't have the knowledge of the particular that it has to have. And that's why things like local government is a conservative idea, because if the guy down the block is my city councilman, I know him, I can go see him. But if my city is run by some appointed person, 100, 200 miles or 500 miles or 1,000 miles from here. They don't know. They're not responsive to me, and they can't possibly know what my block needs, right? They can't have any knowledge of that. And so they attempt to impose abstract ideas on what is. I mean, whatever your block that you live on is like, it's different from mine. It's a different state. It's a different city. It's probably a different type of neighborhood. Houses built during different times, whatever it is. And you probably get more snow in the winter than I do, and you may not have as big a tree as I've got in my yard, and I've got to deal with leaves, and it's just it's different, and that's good. That's desirable. Dr. Kirk always said that that he embraced variety and differences. Variety and differences are always good. When I'll tell you a story. Some years ago, it was probably, I don't know, 12 or 15 years ago now. I made my first trip to Oregon, and I had this couple picked me up at the airport. And I was staying with them, and they picked me up, and I was like, oh, cool. I'm going to get to see Oregon. I'm going to see what Oregon's like, and Oregon's very beautiful. But they said, yeah, we thought we would take you to dinner at Olive Garden. Well, I mean, Olive Garden can be fine, but I've got one like 2 miles from my house at the mall. I've had Olive Garden, but what do they have in Oregon that I don't have? Well, that's what I was interested in. I mean, I wasn't going to be rude and say, I refuse to go there. Take me to your best local restaurant. But because I was appreciative that they were being hospitable. But, things like chain restaurants and so forth, they can be handy, they can be convenient, but they wipe away the local, they wipe away variety, they wipe away interest, and the conservative ought to be celebrating all of those things. I mean, everybody drives through McDonald's every now and then, sure, and their fries are good, but
yeah,
but that's not. But I don't want to live a McDonald's kind of life. That's not. And I think that somebody who's really embracing life isn't going to do that.
Mm-hmm. And that is one thing that Indianapolis has had really good success with, is like local. I think that like microbrewing and kind of some of these little old neighborhoods that get gentrified, and you have this kind of budding of local weird, sort of, I don't know exactly, restaurants or other craft boutique things. Like I've seen that happen here, and a couple other cities, like some of the Midwest cities, Cincinnati, I've seen little areas like over the Rhine crop up.
Yeah, over the Rhine's great.
And I haven't been to Louisville actually recently to see that, or some of the Kentucky cities, but I'm sure that it's happening there as well, where you just have this sort of urban kind of nice revival where it is a local thing, and you can go in and eat at a local place, and you have beer that, like, my buddy works at the farm that sells basically all of the grain to the places that make beer and whiskey here in Indianapolis. Like they are pulling it out of a field just outside the Indianapolis city limits. That's kind of a cool thing. And it's interesting also that it's very much, I feel like, driven to, and the areas that this is happening are also very liberal areas of Indianapolis. Like they have they have their Black Lives Matter signs outside of these shops, and rainbow flags and Biden Harris signs, but also have this interesting localism and tie to that as well. It as you mentioned that, it just kind of struck me. I mean, there are also all your old mom and pop joints where it's like,
right,
the North Side Catholics in Indianapolis all go to these 4 places since I was a kid. Like I grew up in them, but there is kind of a new thing happening too.
Yeah, you can't, and that's where I think people run into a danger when they confuse partisan politics and party affiliation with what's worth preserving and not or not. So I might go to a shop that I don't agree with the voting record of the owner, and I may not agree with the signs in the window, and it may not be my preference the TV show they're running in or whatever, but they have really good pizza, and it's somebody who lives close to me, and they're seeking to make a living for themselves, and all of those are very traditionalist type things that we ought to embrace and celebrate. And so people have to be careful, and this is one of the, sometimes it's frustrating because very often from the left we see a hostility from people we might want to support. We see a hostility towards people who may have views that, like, I might have. Mm-hmm. And, so they may not be as welcoming to me as I wish they were sometimes. But I have to, and there's a point where we might decide, well, forget them. But it's also the case that I want my community to thrive and to do well, and I want there to be a variety of places to go, and I like good pizza or good donuts or whatever it is. And I don't have to know how they vote at all. In fact, I'm probably better off not knowing, even if they agree with me. Mm-hmm. One of the real dangers that we've run into is this idea that we have to know how you vote or how I vote before we can decide whether we can be friends or not. Mm-hmm. And how we vote ought to be one of the least interesting things about us, and but ideology, there's ideology again. Ideology tells you differently. That ideology tells you that the most important thing is, are we making society perfect according to this abstract vision that I have? And if you're not cooperating with that, then you're opposed to Rousseau's general will, and we're going to throw you in a camp somewhere. I mean, that's where that thinking goes. But I think that the traditionalist, the conservative, small c, says, I forget that. I want good pizza. I want to. And I appreciate this person, because underneath all of that, a lot of times people are actually quite interesting and nice if you can get past the politics a lot of time. That's one of the real problems that we've had the past 4 years, because, and really I guess longer than that, but it's been amplified because people have wanted to identify with tribes of red and blue and so forth. And a conservative mindset's trying to transcend that, and vote for who you want to vote for, and I voted for who I want to vote for, and I can have pleasure or disappointment in the win totals. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, regardless of who's in the White House or who's in Congress, I'm still living here, and I've still got my wife and kids, and I want to enjoy my life. And so whether George Bush was president, or Bill Clinton, or Barack Obama, or Donald Trump, I was living my life through all of that. And why do I want to let whoever's in the White House have some sort of weight on me in my day-to-day life? And the answer is I don't. And so, they're going back and forth right now about who's won and so forth. Okay, whatever. But somebody will be in the White House in 2021. But regardless of who it is, I still want to live a life that is embracing the variety of life and recognizing the traditions that have brought us to this point, and hoping to pass those on.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree, and I'm kind of the same way where I approach it the same way you do, where I don't care necessarily what that person embraces. I think it's interesting to see people who would probably say that they reject localism, that they want kind of the generally, if you're voting that way, that you want the big, strong, totalizing government. You want more federal power overseeing the intricacies of our local government, who are also at the same time creating this very local niche restaurant, creating this very local community at the same time. And I think that there's a cognitive dissonance and also a power of that ability for the human, the natural way of we want to live with that local community that comes through even when I think for people who might be bought into an ideology, I guess is the reason why I brought that up. But I know we are also getting close to our time here. Are there anything else that you wanted to make sure that you mentioned on your last thoughts there?
Oh, not particularly. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things. It's one of the nice things, again, is that this kind of media gives us an opportunity to talk to people about these sorts of things. I mean, we're recording this in the evening. I went through the entire day and had no conversations about this with anyone. That's probably good in that you shouldn't spend your entire time doing that, but it's also nice to know that there are people interested in these sorts of things. And I think that people like Russel Kirk and Roger Scruton were seeking to perpetuate those ideas for people like us. And you and I may not be Scruton or Kirk, but we can help to alert people to their thinking of other people, because we're living in an increasingly mass society. It's only going to get worse because of social media, big tech, and that sort of thing. I mean, it's increasingly invading and surrounding us, and we have to understand what its limits ought to be, and that the means are not always the end, right? So that we can't let, just because something can be done doesn't mean it should be done, and that it may be necessary, and it will be necessary, already is necessary, for us to draw limits on those things, and to carve out not only sort of that cell of humane living, but to find ways of doing that socially, and getting together with like-minded people. Doing it virtually is great. Doing it in person is even better. And those are things that we need, and that mankind will always need. And we have to, in this age of technological isolation, we have to kind of actively fight against it. It's better to go to church than watch church, for example. We may be in a situation where live stream is what we've got, but long term, that's not a replacement for what we get when we're there in person. In the long term, it's better not to have a mask that separates me seeing the other person. As we learn, each face is an icon of God, right? We're made in God's image, and if we're constantly hiding that from each other, it's dehumanizing, as you said. It's something that makes individuals an abstraction, because all we see is a mask, and we don't see the person anymore, and we lose a lot from that.
I agree. Well, that was a great way to wrap up the show.
Well, thanks.
So that was awesome. And For everyone out there listening, where can they find you? Where should they go to look?
They can find the Cultural Debris podcast wherever fine podcasts are listened to. I'm available on Apple Podcasts, Google, and Spotify, and I think iHeart. I think it's active on iHeart now. And then they can find me on Twitter at Alan, Alan Cornett, Cornett, where I talk about politics and sometimes Kentucky basketball. And don't always expect me to be serious on on there. But I enjoy interacting with people in those places. And if there are people who are interested in Kentucky or Southern food, they can go to the Eat Kentucky podcast, and also on Instagram. I have an Instagram, a personal Instagram account at Alan Cornett, which is not political at all, but pursue different books and clothes and that sort of thing. So
wonderful, awesome. Well, and all that stuff will be in the show notes for anyone listening. So definitely check out what Alan's got going on and all the stuff that he mentioned. And thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate the conversation. It was awesome.
I appreciate you having me. Thanks a lot, Nick.
Thanks for listening to this interview with Alan Cornett from the Cultural Debris podcast. I really recommend, like I said, go over and check out his work there. I listened to a couple of the episodes already and lots of good stuff there. So definitely check that out and more of what he's doing, because I think really it's very good work and a very unique perspective, and more people should be checking out what he's doing. So definitely go over there and check out what he's got going on. And as a reminder, subscribe to the podcast if you're still checking out. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button and make sure that you don't miss anything that's happening with the conversation of our generation. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Conversation of Our Generation. Let's get the dialogue going. I'll talk to you next time.